Thank you. That's great. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is a meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. My name is David Plum, and my job here is just to help facilitate these meetings. Just a couple Zoom housekeeping things. This is one big happy Zoom meeting. There's no differentiation between Vermont Climate Councilors and other participants. What we do ask is, unless you're going to be presenting or you're a member of the council, if you could keep your camera off until public comment, and that just helps clean up the screen a little bit. I know we've got some folks in from task groups and others who will be help presenting, and that's great. Thank you for joining us. If you want to keep your camera on, that's fine too. If you're a member of the public, just we ask you to kindly refrain from the chat and keep your camera off until we do public comment. I will mention that because of significant input around how public comment's handled in these meetings, we've been changing the public comment, and you'll notice that we're interspersing it a little bit more and giving time for climate counselors to react to public comment. So you'll notice there's a little bit different way of handling it in this agenda. Thanks, Marion, for putting the documents in. Let me turn this over to your chair, Secretary Klauser, to kick us off this morning.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. I'll just quickly run through the agenda, and Marion dropped this in the chat. So for folks who want to follow along, it is there, as well as the other documents that will be discussed at today's meeting. So we'll start with a review and approval of the July 18th meeting minutes. At 11:10, we will go into a just transition reflection, which features an introduction of our new youth counselor. Then at 11:25, the transportation task leads will present some supplemental recommendations in that space. Going to David's comment, we have changed the public comment section, so you'll find kind of the first area for public comment at 12:25. Followed by a break, and then we will come back and have some time for the council to reflect on that public comment. At 1 o'clock, Jane and I will give an update on kind of the Budget 101 process that was requested in our last meeting, and talk about preliminary priorities and A&R's capacity. And then we will follow with an additional opportunity for public comment at 1:50, with next steps and adjournment at 2 p.m.
So just to be clear, I want to make sure, Kristen, that we're looking at the same version of the agenda that's online right now, because there's been a little swapping around on Friday, and I think it may have muddled us up a little bit. And to make sure we had folks from subcommittees available, we're going to try to do before the break the conversation on the budget, and then after the break do the transportation piece.
Okay, so we'll do budget at 11:25 and transportation at 1.
Yeah. And we did that to accommodate people's schedules, and that change happened on Friday. So if any of you looked at the agenda prior to Friday, you saw exactly the version that Secretary Klauser just laid out. The link in the chat right now will show this new version with the budget conversation coming first and transportation coming second.
Okay, perfect. And I just for folks who may have downloaded that this morning online, that was the old version. So discard that and just look at the chat version.
Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for flexibility on the agenda pieces. Again, it's trying to make sure folks are available to present on the subcommittee budget proposals. Okay. Any questions about the agenda that Secretary Klauser laid out? All good? Okay, great. Okay, so let us dive into it. And the first thing we want to do, and maybe I can ask Jane to help us in this just transition for reflection and introducing youth representatives. And Jane, if you want to do that, it's great. If you want to introduce yourself as well, that's always a good thing to do.
Morning, everyone. Jean Lazorchak with the Agency of Natural Resources. I am going to thank Marion for working really closely with Mariah Kagi to have her here with us today to provide the context and overview and introduction of the youth representatives. First and foremost, your new youth counselor, and then also the new members that we've worked to nominate and have approved for this, the various subcommittees and the coordination that's happening to provide capacity and support across those through Mariah and Veep. So thank you to Marion for making sure everyone was here, and I'm going to ask that Mariah provide the overview and update and take the time to introduce everyone today.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks for inviting me here. It's an honor, and in my role as with Vermont Energy Education Program, I'm the Energy Action Projects Advisor, as well as the projects manager. And so what that means is that I support young folks and older folks on figuring out how to navigate systems to get things done on energy and climate. And so in that role, this is just a little bit of background. I've been chatting with the two former youth counselors on and off throughout their time, and really trying to dig into how to help create a system that felt more supportive for them, while they really appreciate all of you awesome humans that they've been working with. And they just that aspect of it's pretty tough to be sort of that nominating to be the one young person who is the youth representative of all the youth, and just sort of that feels like a pretty heavy burden for one person, especially not being part of an organization or whatnot. And so, so throughout the last year and a half, Iris and I really honed in on, okay, well, what does that support look like? What are some of the needs? And what came out of that was what was presented to all of you that was approved in terms of standing up a youth advisory. And so, so not only in supporting Lily in her role, but also just having other young people who are eyes and ears and voting members of the subcommittees, that then we all can get together as part of a youth advisory. And my role is simply support in whatever they ask me to do. At the moment, I'm helping to set up meetings and potentially helping to navigate some school systems to help make this a little bit more possible for folks. And just sort of general support. What do you need? And that's it. So I think that I will let the youth members introduce themselves. And I think we have almost everyone here. I think we might be missing a couple of folks. But maybe I'll start out with Lily. And Lily, please, if I missed anything, please chime in, because I'm sure that I did.
Yeah, I don't think you missed anything that I can think of. But hi, I'm Lily. I'm from Norwich, Vermont, currently in Hanover, where I go to school. I'm a junior, and what else did we decide we were gonna say? I'm like really interested in being part of the Climate Council to learn more about like how local governments work and how to implement sustainability policies and do good for the world.
Thanks, Lily. You got a little bit, your internet was a little bit dodgy at the very end there, but we heard, I would say, 85% of that.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. It's not always reliable, but
I hear you.
Okay, and I think that let's see, who am I seeing on here? Sonia and Jenna together in the same room. Awesome. Jump on in.
Hi, I'm Jenna Hirschman. I go to Essex as to Sonia. I'm also a junior. I use she, her pronouns. And I wanted to be, I'm the Dress Transitions new youth subcommittee member. And I wanted to be on Dress Transitions because it's our future, and I want to make sure that youth has a voice in how we make decisions. And this role has a lot to do with making decisions about our climate future. And I think that's really important, as well as keeping it just and making sure that everyone has a seat at the table and making sure that all the decisions we make are equitable.
Hi, I'm Sonia. I'm a member of the Ag and Eco Subcommittee. I'm also a junior at Essex, and I really wanted to join the subcommittee because for a while, I've been really interested in climate change and agriculture, and specifically the effects that agriculture can have. And I think this was just like a perfect blend of both of my interests. And I also wanted to learn more about the legislative process along the way.
And the two folks who I'm looking for, I don't know if you're on here. Stella, are you on here? Or Miriam?
So Miriam actually asked if I could just say something for her. She couldn't make it because of school, which is an issue that still has to be navigated. We're starting up the school years, and so it's really hard to miss right now, just because it's like important things that are happen in the beginning of the school year. But Miriam is ninth grader, sorry, at Montpelier High School. And yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to say for Miriam.
Great. And is Stella on here? I know that Stella was navigating she's a high school student, but is taking a college course that the schedule got changed. I know that she's trying to navigate things as well. And so I didn't know if she would be joining today, but either way, this is your awesome crew of folks that make up the youth advisory and supporting Lily and the rest of you all in whatever way that looks like. Just sort of as a FYI about what things look like at the moment, we have a standing meeting together every other week, and to just sort of check in and provide supports and say, okay, what are the needs, what's going on? So definitely feel free to be in touch with me, anyone, if that's helpful, if there's anything you want to pass on to the whole youth advisory group. And yeah, thank you again for all your work.
Thanks, Mariah, and thanks everyone. This also is the legacy of Iris, right? Did she envision having more representation and having supported representation? So again, Iris continues to provide benefits this Climate Council through this new group of talented folks. Thanks, everyone. And any comments, questions, thoughts from counselors before we move on to the next thing? Okay, great. Wonderful. All right, good. From the inspirational to the mundane, I forgot we have to approve minutes from last time. So let's do that quickly. If Marion, if you could drop the link to the minutes in the chat, that would be great. If anybody needs a second more to open those up and look through them, we'll give that. They should be attached right in the agenda. So click through the agenda and they'll be right there. Does anybody need a little more time to look through those? Any concerns about those minutes from our last meeting? All right, I'm not seeing any concerns. I'm not hearing folks wanting a little more time. So let's assume those minutes are approved. Thanks everyone for that. Okay, great. So our first big conversation, as we said, is around the budget piece. And we're going to do a couple things in this conversation. One, Secretary Clauser is going to give us an overview of the budgeting process so that we understand how that we as a council, you as counselors, and together as the council can have the most productive and impactful piece of work on this. And then we're going to hear from subcommittees that have been talking about priorities from their perspectives. We don't need to make a decision on this today. We do need to understand better the process, and we need to understand the priorities that are emerging from subcommittees. And then later, and Secretary Clauser will tell us about this, sort of when that is. Later, probably in October, we're going to start to provide a clear recommendation. Secretary Clauser, let me turn it over to you, because I think you're the key piece here in helping all of us understand the process and how the council can fit into that process.
Sure. Thanks, David. I also appreciate the fact that when you said we're going to go back to the mundane, you were talking about the minutes and not the budget.
Not the budget. The budget is...
For a minute, I thought we were talking about the budget presentation.
No way. No way. Never.
So I am going to attempt to give folks a kind of state government budgeting 101 at a very high level, as requested from both steering committee members and also I think the broader Climate Council as a whole. So as we mentioned last time we were together, there is a kind of a budgeting timeline with respect to folks in the executive branch who provide recommendations and requests to the governor in the hopes that the governor will include those requests and recommendations in his proposed budget that is presented to the legislature in January, and then the legislature spends the rest of the legislative session. Usually the big bill, the budget, is one of the last pieces of legislation that's passed in May, typically. Sometimes it happens a little earlier, but that's kind of the high level time frame for executive agencies and departments. Their target date to have a budget request sent to the Department of Finance and Management, who assimilates those requests and ultimately meets with departments and then makes a final recommendation to the governor. That date is October 11th for agencies and departments to get their initial requests to the Department of Finance and Management. Then in November and December, those requests are fine-tuned and a final request or package is presented to the governor for more fine-tuning and consideration and ultimately inclusion in that January governor's recommended budget. So I think folks thought it would be helpful if there was kind of a general understanding of the revenue streams and how budgets are put together and targets, et cetera. Again, this is meant to be very high level, just to give folks kind of the general basics. So a typical budget, it's been a little interesting from a budgeting state government perspective the last couple of years because of all of the federal money that was coming in through the Coronavirus Relief Fund, through ARPA and other ARPA federal related projects and grants. So setting that aside, this year we're going to return to what looks a little bit more like a normal budgeting year, although there's still a lot of federal money and federal opportunities to come. But for purposes of kind of our discussion today, there's generally kind of three categories of funding sources for which your budget is combined. The first is the base budget. So base budget is what most folks consider as their actual budget. So this is operating expenses, right? It's staff, it's rent, it's costs for copying and equipment. In the case of the council, it's counselor per diems. Those are all things that are included in the base budget. And for FY23, the base budget for the Climate Action Office was $1.1 million. We have also, in the materials that are included actually, Jane just put a link to those. So you'll see a table in those materials on page 2. And the first section of that table is the base ongoing appropriation. So those are the components that have historically made up the base budget for the Climate Action Office. Those are things like A&R staff, operating expenses, per diems, and contracted services. When we talk about contracted services, Those are generally services for the facilitation of the meetings that David and his team present. So that's not discussing contracted services for things like studies, etc. Those fall into what is the next category of one-time appropriations. But sticking with base budget for a minute, this chart kind of shows the historical base budget for the Climate Action Office or the Climate Council. This year, the executive branch set out a target for agencies and departments to hit in their base budget, which included a 3% growth target. And that's 3% from the as passed version of the last fiscal year's budget. What we mean when we say as passed, oftentimes the governor's recommended budget is different than the budget that is ultimately passed by the legislature. So we ask agencies and departments to base their targets on what was actually passed by the legislature, not what was recommended by the governor. So if you apply that 3% target, just for context, to the Climate Action Office, that would put a base spending target on the Climate Action Office of $1,133,000. So that's a 3% growth rate. And the 3% growth is meant to accommodate for things like increases in salary and benefits and just increased costs of those operating expenses. So that's base budget. What we also have in state government often, although not every year, are surplus revenue and carry forward. So those two items are depicted in that second section of the of table 1 here that we're looking at. One-time appropriations and carry forward. One-time appropriations are typically made with surplus revenue. What does that mean? So we base our budgets on forecasted revenue. Then at the end of the year, when we actually have all of the revenue from the operating year, sometimes, not always, but sometimes there is a surplus. So there's more money than we forecast. We forecasted we would bring in a certain amount of money, but we actually received through state revenues more money than that what was forecasted. And so that is considered surplus revenue that can be rolled over into the next fiscal year. And you can request appropriations for that money. Typically, when you're dealing with, and surplus can vary. Some years it's $1 million, $25 million. The last several years, it's been more substantial, more than we've really ever seen in state government. I believe last year it was a $225 million surplus, which are things that we've really never seen before, but that's what we have been dealing with in the past couple of years. Typically, when we request appropriations for surplus money, this one-time appropriations, we try to use those for things that are well-defined and time-bound, because it's a one-year surplus and we have no idea if that will happen the following year or in what amount it will happen the following year. So we try to direct surplus money to one-time appropriations. So not to operating expenses, right? Things like contracted services for a specific research project or a construction project for a set number of EV charging stations, something that has a start, an end, and a specific amount associated with that. 1 to 2 year projects typically. The second, or the third rather, type of money that you see reflected here is called carry forward. This is similar to surplus money in that we typically try and use it for kind of one-time non-recurring expenses. The difference here is that surplus money is money that was received that exceeds the forecast for which the budget was based on. Carry forward money is money that was appropriated to an agency or department, but not used during the course of that fiscal year for whatever reason. And so the Secretary of Administration has the authority in session law to authorize the use of carry forward money for certain funds, general fund, transportation fund, et cetera. And once authorized, that money can be carried forward into the next fiscal year. So FY22 carry forward can be carried forward into FY23, for example, 23 into 24. And then the expenditure of that carry forward is not automatic, but is rather subject to the approval by the Department of Finance and Management with the Secretary of Administration's approval. So it is not, the expenditure is not automatic, but it can be done, and assuming carry forward money stays within the agency or department, which, and more specifically the DEPT-ID, but as generally speaking, assuming it stays within the same agency or department that it was carried forward to, then there's a bit more flexibility for that money in that the Department of Finance and Management, with approval of the Secretary, can make expenditures. It doesn't need legislative approval and appropriations, which is different than surplus one-time appropriations, which does require the legislature. So that's kind of the broad strokes of budgeting and kind of the different categories of revenue and spending and how that works. With respect specifically to the Climate Action Office, like I said, we could assume a base budget FY24 to be $1,133,000 if we're working off of the 3% target that was issued to other executive agencies and departments. In addition, you'll see the chart shows some carry forward and one-time appropriations. And the A&R is anticipating about $800,000 is going to be required for the continuation of existing work based on kind of statutory requirements and priorities. And those three particular pieces of work are listed in the memo. Jane can talk about them more specifically if people have questions, but that is, continuing the work that we have either already committed to or statutorily required to continue. And that would come with a one-time surplus ask of an additional $800,000, which A&R intends to put in their recommended items for their FY24 budget that will be sent up to the governor. This is also kind of in line with what the current capacity at A&R, with the capacity at A&R to both do this additional work, but also continue to complete the work that we've already undertaken thus far. So those two things are in line. But again, if there's more specific questions, Jane is here to talk about those. And I'm happy to answer general questions as well if folks have them.
Great. So can I ask a quick question as a follow-up, Secretary Klesser? And that is, in addition to talking about the budget for the climate office, are you seeing a role for the council in talking about other climate related funding stuff, right? Like at the end of last year, when we were looking at all the federal money and all that, we were talking about buckets of like weatherization, blah, blah, blah. Is there something to be done there as well, in addition to the climate office specific funding?
Yeah, so the ARPA money, so I should say that the money we just discussed, right, the $1.1 million, the additional $800,000 ask, that is specifically directed to the Climate Action Office. That has nothing, that is in addition to kind of the $200 million, over $200 million of one-time money that was already appropriated via ARPA or the budget last year. So there was a great deal of ARPA money, about a little over 160 million of ARPA money that was appropriated to different kind of climate related initiatives. And then there was additional $40 million of general fund one-time surplus money that was directed towards things like working lands and EV charging infrastructure and weatherization, et cetera. So this money that we're talking about now is specifically related to the Climate Action Office and the work that they've kind of undertaken as a result of the statutory requirements and the cap, the initial cap, and studies referenced in there. All of the ARPA money has already been appropriated. So those were last year and the year before budget discussions, and the legislature has appropriated all of the ARPA money. So I'm not sure there's much of a role here for the council with respect to proposed uses or direction of that money, as it's already been appropriated through legislative action.
Great, super. Okay, Jane, go ahead, please.
I just appreciate Secretary Clauser walking through that, and just wanted to put a finer point on the components in the memo that we circulated from Secretary Moore this morning that are lifted up there. Those are specific funding requests that ANR envisions making as a component of the Climate Action Office related to our finishing out or continuing on with our GWSA requirements. They are not, I want to just say that they are not inclusive of perhaps other one-time funding asks that will work through a larger agency process to move up to the governor that the Climate Action Office might also request. So these are narrow in focus and specific to GWSA requirements as we see the work continuing into the next fiscal year. But there is limited additional capacity within the Climate Action Office to further advance other one-time requests that may or may not be lifted up through Secretary Moore. And that's a process that we're working through similar to other agencies. And that component down at the bottom of this memo, as Secretary Clauser was speaking to around one-time funding, is the process that I think that we spoke about with the steering committee, where the Climate Council could make a similar request to be considered by the governor in his process at the October meeting, where there was a memo prepared with specific priorities lifted up from the subcommittees that speak to wants and desires related to one-time funding that meet these specific criteria for the governor to consider as he considers requests more broadly across state government and building his budget. And so I just wanted to lift that up specific around these three components, especially since we, shame on us for using an acronym for RCI, I should say thermal emissions sector. This is, I'll just say, this is a continued ongoing of the work that you all asked us, and we are working towards the thermal analysis for the thermal sector. That is a sort of backfilling of ANR funds that we're using to support the $200,000, as well as additional capacity in that space to be thinking about data needs in the thermal sector at a high level. So that's what that $400,000 is for. The implementation of the Municipal Vulnerability Index, that second bullet, is that we expect to have a completed tool by this spring, and know that the tool is only as good as the capacity there to drive the application of it at a municipal level. And so are thinking about ways to strategically partner with RPCs and others and requesting that money to do that, so that that requirement of ANR is advanced, and with working closely with the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. And then finally, we have funding in our budget around the development of the Measuring and Assessing Progress tool, but that first phase one is really about scale and scope and a lot of stakeholder engagement. And this would really get us to think about how we build out that tool in further out fiscal years. So we expect and will consider further requests through Secretary Moore for additional one-time funding asks, but these are the specific ones that we wanted to highlight here as they relate to ongoing analyses and work and our specific GWSA requirements. And then finally, I'll just say, I'm not going to speak to it broadly, but happy to answer questions in light of the council considering budget requests or putting forward a memo to the governor and key legislators. We also wanted to sort of speak to ANR's sort of varying capacity that we will continue to provide with the council in that separate memo that I also shared in the link and sent you out a little with more appropriate amount of time to review ahead of this meeting a week or so ago, that really outlines ANR's long-term role and commitment to supporting the council in what components and where capacity is shifting. And that should hopefully help and aid in the conversation too, as you think about this.
Okay, great. All right. And just to be super clear for everybody, if the council, the Vermont Climate Council meets on October 17th, and in that meeting agrees to a memo that lays out some ideas / priorities, that's not too late, right? That's fine. That's Secretary Clauser.
Yeah, that is fine and certainly within the timeline required for consideration. I know I've mentioned this ad nauseum, but the hope is that what we have outlined today it includes what at least the administrative members of the council would be able to support by way of recommendation to the governor. We would have to abstain from voting on any additional budget asks beyond what's included in this memo.
Okay. Okay. All right. So we have some other things to present which are coming out of subcommittees. Before we do that, are there additional questions for Secretary Clauser or for Jane about this overview? Joey?
Not any questions. That was really helpful. Thank you, Secretary Clauser. Thanks, Jane. But I guess an overarching question, I think I've asked this before, Jane, and it may not be ready yet, but it may be helpful to better understand the different positions of the climate office and what role they may be playing on, in different ways that could fill a need that, subcommittees have identified as priorities. But anyway, it just seemed that would be helpful to me, and maybe you have that, and I apologize if you've sent that and shared that in level of detail. But that may inform what kinds of recommendations, if we have a limited budget, what is the climate office going to be doing, and what other more specific one-time needs could we recommend? That would be helpful to me to and then one other question, and I don't know who this is for, but I know all the federal funds, the different buckets, some of them are have very strict parameters, and I know some of that landscape has shifted since allocations were made, like the Municipal Energy Resilience Initiative, for example. So I guess one of the questions I have is, are there any big things that we should be aware of that we may not be, that you all are seeing as pretty big gaps, holes, or needs? And what of those might help be met through one-time dollars? Anyway, so those are two different questions, but I think it would be helpful context for me anyway to better understand some of those things. Thank you.
Thanks, Joey. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, just I guess related to Johanna's question. We've been involved in discussions around Act 172, H518, the municipal energy efficiency and fuel switching bill, basically, for lack of a better term. where there's been challenges using ARPA as envisioned by the statute. And so now we're having having discussions about how to make that work. Now I'm just curious if there are like other unexpected budget matters, budgetary appropriations matters that have appeared, since the sessions, legislative sessions ending, that have popped up that are also going to possibly influence budgetary discussions going forward in this upcoming session. That might impact everything else that we're talking about.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm curious, Jane and Secretary Clauser, if there's some immediate things you want to say about these answers, these questions, in addition to saying we'll get back to you, but are there some immediate things you might be able to say to help answer some of these questions, Jane?
Yeah, I'm just going to speak to the climate office, and then Secretary Clauser, if there's anything on larger budget issues, you please take that one. I'll just say to Joey's first question that the A&R Climate Action Office is something that was stood up in the fiscal year 23 budget. We're currently working through building that transitional office with existing positions like mine and Marianne's being reclassified and rechanged, and then other positions from our agency being consolidated into the Climate Action Office, as well as new positions being hired. It's a transitional process that's not fully implemented yet. So what I will say that is the specificity around the role of the Climate Action Office that I can provide at this point is what I've been able to speak to in the A&R memo on capacity, and that I very much think that at an upcoming council meeting, as the Climate Action Office is solidified, that this presentation about roles, responsibilities, work planning is something that would feel very appropriate for the council to hear.
Okay, great. Joey?
I mean, that, I totally get that, Jane, that makes sense. I guess, I mean, I know like you talked about hiring a public engagement person. I'm trying to think about like, what are the roles? And I don't quite remember all the different roles, and it's probably a work in progress, but if we have limited budgets, what can we anticipate one person like that to do to supplement what we have identified as needs potentially, or what we may be identifying as needs? So that's just an example of what I'm trying to grapple with in my mind.
I can at least drop in the chat the policy paper that was lifted up to the governor and then used in the legislative session to advocate for the base funding for the Climate Action Office, which has a general outline of roles and responsibilities. And I do think that while specificity is being put on the bones of all of this, things are changing a bit. It's still a really good sort of base map to look at for the roles and responsibilities of the staff that will be in the Climate Office.
Okay, great. Rich, go ahead, please.
Well, I'll speak a little later, I think, on behalf of the cross-sector committee and its recommendations separately. But in addition to that, I think we should discuss a problem with the budget and as presented, and that is the loss of some of the really important functions that Jane has been providing over the past year and a half, 2 years. One of the things that we, all have benefited from is the fact that she was deeply involved, not only in the council meetings and the council-wide discussions, but also in each of the committees. And the coordination across the committees was facilitated greatly by Jane and Marianne, knowing what's going on in the different committees and sort of transferring that knowledge informally in conversations with other members of other committees, and this sort of cross-linking work and coordination work that was so terrific. And so I told Jane to be prepared to be complimented on it, but we've learned to rely on it. And it's going to be hard to replace that by saying, oh, well, we'll assign individual staff members to support individual subcommittees. So I think that for the council as a whole, we should recognize that we need something more.
Thanks, Rich. So in that spirit, why don't we hear what the subcommittees are putting forward, so we don't run out of time for that? And when we can circle back to these bigger conversations after we've heard all that. And I know we've got a couple subcommittees that are prepared to say some words. Some might even have a presentation. I don't have an order of who's going first. But I wonder, Jane, did you have a vision of order of the different subcommittees right now?
No, I think whoever would like to lean in and step up first.
Great. Okay. Rich, because your mic's still open, do you want to walk through the cross-sector subcommittees thinking around budget and priorities? And again, we've got, I think, 4 groups, if not 5 groups, saying something today. So we got to keep it on the tight, relatively efficient use of time. But Rich, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I was going to suggest that just transitions go first, but it's fine because I'll be short.
Okay.
We've had a series of discussions around budget priorities in cross-sector. You've heard on the thermal side, our recommendation at the last council meeting, and then the action that the administration took to pursue funding an RFP to do work on thermal. And that's terrific. We support that. The transportation working group will speak later. And there are some recommendations from transportation about some research that would be needed, to assess the impact and the economic cost of different transportation policies. The committee is going to continue to look at this, and we determined that we would come back to the steering committee with a more refined proposal at next month. We identified, and I think probably every committee will identify, the importance of outreach, and we think to support any of the work of the council, and including the cross-sector work, we need to make sure that we are doing more listening. We are speaking to frontline and affected communities and to all Vermonters about the policies that are included in the CAP, and that would most likely need to be considered for any revisions to the CAP. So outreach high on the list. I think that's it. That anybody else on the committee want to chime in?
Thanks, Rich. Great. Okay. Super. That's really helpful. Why don't we go to just transitions? I know Abby, co-chair Abby Willard, is here. And I think, Abby, you're going to present what Just Transitions has been working on.
Yeah, thanks, David. Good morning, all. I'm Abby Willard. I am the co-chair of the Just Transition Subcommittee, along with Sue Minter. I also, for those that don't know me, I'm the Development Division Director at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and use she, her pronouns. David, would it be helpful? Do I need to do a screen share of our proposal? I know committee members saw this in advance. Or council
I'm happy to, yeah.
it.
I think it's great to show it. And if you'd like me to put it up on the screen, I can do that for you. Or
yeah, that'd be great, David, if you have it.
Yeah, give me a second, I'll pull it up.
Okay, so while David's doing that, I just want to note a little bit about the process that the Just Transition Subcommittee went through over the past month since this budget proposal process was shared with us. Oh, hang on one second. That loses my notes. So let me just exit full screen here for a second. Okay, thank you, David.
You bet.
So we are proposing this as a climate engagement draft budget proposal for FY24. And this has not been shared with reviewed with the full Just Transition Subcommittee. So last month, the Just Transition Subcommittee met and put together a small subcommittee to draft a proposed budget request for you as the council today. We meet as a full subcommittee later this week. So this subcommittee has still been meeting monthly. Our next September meeting is on Thursday. So on Thursday, we'll have that opportunity to discuss each of these proposed priorities, share any feedback that we hear from you as the council today, and then engage in a prioritization exercise as a full subcommittee. So I think we can move now to the proposal here that David put up on the screen. So I just want to kind of outline that the overarching theme to this proposed budget is a concerted investment and acknowledgement of the importance of having sufficiently resourced community engagement and the need for some more intentional training around equity and the guiding principles that were developed by the Just Transition Subcommittee and then approved by this council. So aligning with Rich's priority from cross-sector around outreach and engagement as a priority of this draft proposal. And I just wanted to acknowledge that as we've talked about the governor's commitment of over $200 million for climate-related work last fiscal year, that this proposal focused primarily on outreach and engagement still represents less than 0.5% of the total investments dedicated for climate related community engagement and outreach efforts. And we as a subcommittee are hoping that in the future, that commitment towards outreach and education of reaching frontline and impacted communities can someday far exceed 0.5%. We also just wanted to acknowledge, as we've talked about today around overarching budgets, that there are some kind of still to be determined priorities coming out of the Climate Action Office around what the outreach and engagement resources, capacity, and priorities may be. So I would just say that from our subcommittee, our intent would be that we don't want to be duplicative, but that we also want to ensure that any existing climate-related allocations include an equitable and a sufficient focus towards the outreach and education goals. Overall, this proposal is really looking at transforming how we do work here in Vermont, and that guides a just transition, provides critical equity training, and intentionally supports individuals' involvement in meeting people where they at in their local community. So we can go through each of these individually. There's 7 components, many of which are interrelated. The first is around direct engagement with community members. So this is building upon some of the recommendations that we received from Rejoice about reaching out into each community to engage frontline community members. And we envisioned some grant resources going to an external consultant to solicit reactions and share the efforts and engage at the community level around climate-related needs, policy development, and programs. This item and one additional do outline, in addition to that, so encapsulated in that $400,000 estimated investment need, that does include part of an additional position that would manage within the Climate Action Office, most likely, that would manage some of the administrative tasks related to these ongoing outreach and engagement needs. So the second item, which is entitled compensation for participation. So as we look at engaging community members, really wanting to have intentional compensation for their time and expertise. So this would include stipends to community members for their participation, as well as increasing per diems for counselors, subcommittee, and task group members. Thinking that compensation includes appreciation of their time, but also addressing other needs to encourage participation like childcare support and possibly providing food. The next section is around training, which is again envisioning a consultant to both coach and train our legislator and state agencies who are developing policy and implementing programs around the equity considerations and just transition concepts. So we are envisioning that these trainings would be supported and guided by the members of the Just Transition Subcommittee, and would utilize the guiding principles and other equity tools to conduct the trainings. The generational engagement was a very specific suggestion and concept to offer climate curricula and additional capacity to ensure that climate justice is incorporated into established programming. So programming for both youth, young adults, and seniors. That's really focused on ensuring that the next generation and individuals on fixed income have access to kind of climate justice resources and education. The communication and marketing item, which is the last one on this page, and yeah, kind of thanks, David, does kind of go over to the next page. This may be, again, where there's this area of overlap with the intentions of the Climate Action Office, but really wanting to focus on acknowledging that communities continue to struggle to access information, particularly systemic issues around climate, and that some of these resources would be best directed towards some non-governmental organizations and consultants that already have established community relationships. So they're closer to being able to reach and influence impacted frontline populations. So this would be looking at, producing more videos, utilizing mixed media, and some like real community level communication around the CAP implementation efforts. The last two, so action opportunities is really a community action investment. So the goal with this proposed budget item was to make funding more community-led and accessible to those frontline communities. So examples would be funding various demonstration projects. I think we mentioned community gardens in here, and other greenhouse gas mitigation projects. So this too may require some additional Climate Action Office administrative support. So in total, I think there was the desire for one potential full-time equivalent position needed. And then the last item is translation services. So recognizing that the accessibility to climate information and opportunities by all Vermonters, including those with limited English proficiency, any disabilities, blind or hard of hearing challenges. While we know that these translation service contracts exist in the state of Vermont, this proposal aims to ensure that there's sufficient resources provided to agencies and others leading climate action plan initiatives to ensure that translation support would be available. So again, this would be another budget amount to be determined depending upon what remains uncovered by the Climate Action Office. So I might turn to any other Just Transition Subcommittee members if you have anything additional to add.
I think you did a great job covering it, and we really appreciate your willingness to do that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abby.
Sure, Kashka.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, Just Transitions, as Abby said, there's a meeting this week to go over this in the full Just Transitions group. So this is very much a proposal, but you can see the thinking level of detail that went into it. Okay, let's hear from a couple other subcommittees to see where folks' heads are at. Rural resilience, Erica, is that falling on your shoulders?
Yep, and Catherine's here too.
Great.
So we have split the difference here with a couple of different initiatives that the RRA subcommittee began discussing. I'm going to cover the first, and then I'm going to hand it over to Catherine to cover the second. These are really conceptual at this point. No, funding numbers attached to these, and very tied to the the charge in the Global Warming Solutions Act for the Rural Resilience Subcommittee. So the first is related to the Municipal Vulnerability Index, which Jane touched upon. We will have an index in the spring of the year, but it will be necessary to have some additional funding to support outreach activities to roll out the results. I anticipate that when the index is published, it's definitely going to create a lot of discussion, potentially some controversy at the local level, and a lot of folks asking, okay, what do we do with these results, and how do we address these vulnerabilities that have now been outlined in this index? So it would be important for towns to understand the results, what they mean to them, translate those results into action steps so that they can lessen their own vulnerability. So in addition to the outreach related to the results of the MBI, one idea that the subcommittee had, which is also included in the recommendations from the subcommittee in the climate action plan, is that grant funding be made available specifically to address the vulnerabilities that are highlighted in the Municipal Vulnerability Index, and possibly utilizing unspent ARPA funding that could be allocated to allow for this. You know, this is a little similar, but a little distinct as well from the ARPA funding that created the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. It really targets vulnerable areas to allow them to address flood vulnerabilities in their communities. And this would be a bit more of a holistic in terms of the vision to be able to address multiple layers of vulnerabilities that will be outlined in that index. Just a point here, under-resourced towns are definitely going to need some additional technical assistance around being able to address their vulnerabilities. If they haven't done so thus far, they don't magically have the resources to do so now. And that is probably a good segue to what Catherine's going to talk about here in just a minute. I'll hand it over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Erica. In addition to the Municipal Vulnerability Index, I'll note that the other project ongoing is the Municipal Toolkit to help to really organize tools that municipalities can use to address their vulnerabilities. But as Erica noted, without the resources to do it, knowledge can only take you so far. So from the climate action plan, there's actually a goal in the plan that we all voted to adopt, which is to establish permanent statewide funding and technical support for local and regional climate resilience planning and project implementation to enhance rural resilience to the impacts of climate change. So that is a goal from the plan, and our recommendations really will follow from that, the one that Erica just noted about the Municipal Vulnerability Index. And then further, it's important that actual resources be dedicated to this. The plan includes a recommendation to increase funding to regional planning commissions and municipalities to support climate and energy planning, targeting funds to support towns with limited staff and marginalized populations in frontline communities. So that I suspect will be a recommendation from our committee. We also included in the plan and supported by the committee are the permanent fund for design and implementation of local and regional climate adaptation and resilience projects, technical assistance to municipalities on flood and erosion risks, and ensuring that we have a state level individual assistance program to help individuals who are harmed by the impacts of climate. And then we also have this outstanding committee task, which is to identify, develop, and share best practices for reducing municipal, school district, residential, commercial, and industrial fossil fuel consumption. And some of that will come from the toolkit, but there may be some gaps that will need to be addressed. I'll note that, thrilled as we are that the climate office will be established at the state level. The climate action plan contains almost 100 references to municipalities and their role in implementing climate action, greenhouse gas reductions, as well as resilience and adaptation. So that support needs to be extended as well, both through regional support, through existing organizations, and direct support to municipalities. And we are meeting again this month where we should be able to fine tune these.
Super. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Erica. Okay. Why don't, unless other members of that subcommittee want to complement what Erica and Catherine just provided, let me pause for a second and let that happen. Anything to supplement what Catherine and Erica just said? Okay. Let's keep going forward. Ag and ecosystem, is there something that folks are prepared to share? I see Billy turn his camera on. Is that a signal that you're prepared to share something, Billy?
Just that we are in the process of working up our recommendation. We have another meeting, I believe the end of next week, where we're going to later this month, where we're going to finalize our recommendation for the group in advance of your October meeting.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Okay. And then with science and data, was there something that folks wanted to share? Jared, was that falling onto you?
Sure. I'm happy to share a brief update. When we last met as a subcommittee, it was very shortly after this, request from the steering committee came out to identify. At that meeting, we were primarily focused on existing sets of analyses that are underway. The work on life cycle analysis to better understand the emissions that come from energy use that happen outside of Vermont's borders as a result of Vermont energy use. Some members of the committee are involved in the Municipal Vulnerability Index, which was already spoken to, and an RFP around agricultural emissions. So the initial focus was on things that are ongoing and that already have some budget. We do have another meeting. We have not met since then, but we have another meeting on Thursday where we'll continue this conversation, but we don't at this point have any specific recommendations to lift up. I think that this is not speaking on behalf of the committee, but me as an individual, my sense is that a lot of what we would be looking to seek funding for will depend on the outcomes of those sets of analysis for which there was an initial RFP and analysis done in terms of what is able to get done from that scope of work versus what is left outstanding or what questions remain. And it's just hard to know that at this point, but we may have more to share back after our subcommittee meeting this Thursday, but don't have much more than that right now. I invite Megan to add to that or
anything else, folks, from science and data to complement what Jared said? Okay. All right. Am I forgetting somebody? I think we did it, right? So I'd like to take a little half step back for a second, because we started with some big questions after Secretary Clauser's presentation, then we went into some of the details from the subcommittees. And I'm just curious, as you all as counselors are listening to this information, you're thinking about how to have impact on the budget this year, and we have time, right? Last time we're doing all this like in December, January, it was a very messy moment. But this time we do have more time. And my question is, what's really going to work as an output from this conversation? Like, let's say we need to plan right now our meeting in October. What do we need to produce? Are we just compiling everything that all the subcommittees do and we put it forward and said, here's their best thinking from our subcommittees? Or do you, as a council, want to do something on top of that? Dare I say the word prioritization? But I'm just curious, when you think about it, what is it that you would like to produce in October so that we can set ourselves up for something successful? Chris?
I would just suggest that I think it's realistic to expect that the agency, the the administration is going to have a package they're going to recommend to the governor. They're tasked with doing that. That's part of their job. They've got guidelines there to follow, and that's totally expected and makes complete sense. It could be that then beyond what they recommend, the folk who are on the council, and it may not be unanimous, it may be different opinions, but there may be recommendations beyond what the administration pulls together and represents, and that's totally fine. I don't think those have to be in conflict with one another, because of having worked for county government and state and others, that's just what you're expected to do. You come up with the executive budget. So I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but it may be that if ahead of the October meeting, if we have that state, the administration, the agency proposals, whether it's separate or hopefully together, a composite, if then we could be able to respond to that with, what the other subcommittees and all, they're thinking, and maybe if there's some other, consensus to be had beyond the administration's budget, that might be a way to approach this. That way nothing's kind of, left behind. We're able to kind of say, this is the conversation we had, these are where we're able to find, where we're in agreement with the administration, and this is where counselors maybe feel like other needs are and what we think the cost might be for those needs to be met. And again, I don't think it needs to be adversarial or confrontational or anything like that. But that would be my suggestion. And of course, I will not be reappointed. So it does maybe for other folk to further deliberate after in the months ahead. But anyway, that's what I would suggest.
Chris, when you imagine that, are you imagining something where the council, let's say all subcommittees have these meetings between now and the October council meeting. They all come back with maybe a table, it looks a little bit more like what Just Transitions presented today, right? What should the council do with that? Should the council try to mold that, lift certain things up, or should the council just put that together and say, this is the best thinking from our subcommittees?
I mean, I don't know if we've got the time, and then just given the public process, I don't, it'd be great to kind of see, how this all potentially meshes in great detail with what the administration puts forward versus what may be external to that. So I don't know if we've got the capacity and time to kind of pull together those public conversations that would need to happen. So it may be, frankly, two sets of lists, and here's the administration proposal, and here are the proposals that come out of the subcommittees. The subcommittees, I think, would need to say, this is where they think their recommendations jive with what the administration has put forward, and this is where they differ. And again, I don't think it needs to be, it's not a confrontational thing. It's just the thinking of the kind of the thinking that's coming forward. People sit on the committee, where they're coming from. The other thing I would just note too, that may be a little bit of a challenge for the subcommittees is necessarily the agency staff are going to need to do what they're directed to do by their bosses. And so it may be that there may be some challenges in cases for agency staff to really engage robustly in those conversations with the subcommittees, and we just need to give them that space to do what they feel like they can, what they can do, and just kind of recognize the nature of the process that that governments follow.
Thanks, Chris. Bram, go ahead.
I think there would be value, to answer your question of, do we do something with the subcommittee's recs or do we just hand them over as is? I think there's some value in doing something with them. Specifically, it seems very likely that there will be multiple recognitions that community engagement in all of our processes is important. And I think to the extent that we can identify the budget and programmatic priorities that are common to two or more subcommittees, that will be helpful to the administration as they look at our work and decide how it fits into the budgeting process.
Thanks, Bram. How are others viewing this? Like, what should be our goal for October? And what should the subcommittees be what guidance do we want to give the subcommittees as they do their meetings over the next few weeks? How to build off what Chris and Bram are saying. Rich?
I think there are really two different things going on. There's the importance of public engagement. And by that, there are quite a number of different elements of public engagement that I think the council over time needs to support. And then there are the kind of analyses with respect to individual elements of the climate action plan that are needed in order to support policy development alongside the public engagement. I mean, those two things go hand in hand. So I would ask the subcommittees to think about both, but to think about them as partners in the progress going forward, but not to neglect the research elements that are needed to support some of these really complicated policy issues. So I think we're doing that, frankly. I mean, we're doing that in the thermal sector. We will be doing that, or we were going to hear some recommendations about transportation. There were certainly other subcommittee priorities that different subcommittees could raise up. But to recognize that we need both, and that I don't want to see the public engagement imperative undermining the ability of the state to collect the information needed to make policy recommendations, and vice versa. You don't want to see the kind of analytical work and the budgeting for the analytical work to undermine the priority that we want to give to public engagement. So I'd ask the subcommittees to think about both.
Thanks, Rich. All right. We seem to be circling around something. I want to circle back also to you, Secretary Clauser, as well, to say, when you think about how this council could be most impactful in its deliberations on these issues, where do you see this council adding some real value to the way the budget conversations can be going on in the administration?
Sure. So I think pieces and parts of what everyone has said thus far would be very helpful. Just using the Just Transition Subcommittee work as an example, right? If subcommittees had this type of specificity laid out for the council to look at, one could identify where there's overlap, both among the subcommittees, in and among the subcommittees, but also from the administration's perspective, the administrative representatives on the council can help identify where there's overlap with work that is already being done by the administration, whether it's funded through ARPA or other one-time funding, or just part of the Climate Action Office's general mission. So I think putting the ideas out there to identify where there's overlap, both within the subcommittees and within work that's already being done, would be incredibly helpful to start to kind of whittle down, prioritize, and focus all of these recommendations. administrative members can certainly be, that's where I think administrative members of the council can be most helpful in kind of identifying where work is already being done in this space, or where work, maybe similar work that's being done in this space, could be leveraged to include some of this work, and try to maximize efficiencies and staff, etc. I think it can also be, the administrative members could also be helpful in, once things are identified, to be able to identify resources for this work. That's a really important component that we can't lose sight of. If we have a long list of things to do, but no one to do it, that makes it very challenging. And so to be able to talk about what resources exist and what additional resources would be necessary and the cost of those resources, and maybe pacing that out a bit, is also helpful. I will just say, from the perspective of my own agency, when we present budgets, we do prioritize, because there are always more asks than there are money, even in times when there's revenue surplus. And so to present an exhaustive list without prioritization, I think is challenging, in that you want to make sure that the most important things rise to the top of that list. So, I certainly don't want to dictate how the council, presents the budget request, but I apologize for the long answer, but I think prioritization is really key, and doing the work ahead of time to identify, what work is already being done and can therefore potentially drop off the list. And I think, to Chris's point, I see any additional asks from council members to be above what the right. We've already tried to lay out what portions A&R and the climate office are willing to already request. So the council should consider those requests being out there and look to what they think is needed on top of those requests. That is in part of the presentation, so that folks understand the work that's already being done, so that they can make requests in light of the work that's already being done or prepared to be requested. I'm not sure how helpful any of that is, but that's.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. And let's take two more hands, and then I want to break for some public comment. But Leslie Ann, let me turn to you first. Leslie Ann, go ahead, please.
Thanks a lot, David. Bram, you sure you don't want to go first?
I already went first.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of echo a lot of what Secretary Clauser was just saying in terms of work that's going on right now that could be leveraged and sort of bring together a lot of those pieces. And one thing I wanted to lift up is my class this semester. It's called Climatology and Natural Hazards, and we're working on an all hazards approach, hopefully in support of the state mitigation planning that's going to kick off this week, but also working directly with the town of Underhill to see what are some of the on-the-ground needs that we've been hearing here in this council that are bubbling up from a rural town perspective, and then maybe use that as a lessons learned to think about the ways in which the both the climate toolkit as well as the municipal vulnerability index could be implemented by having that actual one case. And we're doing this in partnership with Dr. Ned Gardner, who did a lot of this similar type of work with Chicago. So if it's an all-win situation, students are getting some real world experience. We're testing this out, and we're trying to see what works best for our Vermont context. So I just wanted to offer that up in echoing what Secretary Clauser was talking about, other work that's going on in this space here.
Thanks. Very interesting. Maggie, go ahead, and then I'll circle back to Bram and then Joey, and then let's pause for some public comment. Maggie, go ahead, please. You're good.
Okay. I think it took me a couple of clicks, but My name is Maggie Gender, and I'm the Deputy Secretary at the Agency of Natural Resources and filling in for Secretary Moore today. But what I think I'm hearing, and what I also agree with what Secretary Clauser just said, and I know my secretary agrees with, is when we talk about prioritization, it's not necessarily limiting your ideas, rather it's prioritizing them. So you could have a list of 10 ideas, or you could have a list of 5 ideas, but putting the priority, letting people know what your priorities are. And then I think it really helps with what I agree with the second piece that was just talked about too, is then it helps us all look at kind of across the board, whose priorities land where at what agencies, and how can we complement those.
Super. Thanks, Maggie. That's helpful. Bram, go ahead. Thanks for being patient.
I apologize in advance if the question that I'm about to ask causes any disruption or discomfort to anybody. That is not my intent at all. My intent is to help Vermont get to its goals as quickly as possible. And of course, my ultimate loyalty is to the planet. But my understanding is that the council is meant to be independent of the legislature and independent of the administration. And so I wonder if, when we have identified our budget priorities, what we think the most important ways to use money and the amounts of money to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to ensure a just transition and all the other goals that we have, should we forward those budget requests to both the administration and the legislature?
Great question. I imagine that you as a council could make a decision on that, right? Whether Jane, have you something to say about that, or yeah?
Yeah, just last year, that was the process that you used for ARPA, and I would imagine that's the process that you would use here, so the governor could consider the priorities, and then the legislature could further consider the priorities.
Nice. Thanks, Bram.
Thank you.
Secretary Clauser, I bet you have something to say directly on that point, right? Okay, jump in, please.
And this may go without saying, but I just want to be crystal clear with this. Recommendation from the governor to the legislature is simply that, right? It's the governor's recommended budget. So even if something was included in the governor's recommended budget, there's no guarantee that that item will be ultimately funded by the legislature. So I just, in the spirit of Budget 101, I just want to make sure that folks are crystal clear to that. And I think it goes directly to Bram's point. Historically, I believe that there was typically a memo sent to the governor with requests, and that same memo was forwarded to the legislature with requests. So just wanted to make sure that I was very clear on the procedural process of that.
Thanks. That's helpful, person. Okay, Joey, last word, and let's do public comment.
Just really quickly, thank you all for this conversation. It would be helpful, and I'm just thinking about for cross-sector, Rich, you laid out like 2 different buckets. I would make it 3, and I wonder if other subcommittees might want to think about it in this way, with a lens of prioritization, which I think is important, is public engagement and outreach, technical analysis, and then general organizing support to I'm curious if other subcommittees think that the role of, that Jane has played, which I agree has been really invaluable, is necessary. And is there a need for something along those lines? I'd love to hear that from other subcommittees. And then to the other point of how this complements other work that is underway that I think is really important. It may be helpful for subcommittees to identify where there are those nexuses. And one of the things, I really appreciate all the good work that came out of Just Transitions and some really thoughtful recommendations and clear needs. And I'm sort of wondering, we have this really important, environmental justice policy that's being stood up, and how these efforts can synergize. And I'm sure that Just Transitions is thinking about that. But I know there may be some capacity needs to support that implementation and how they are connected. I'd love to learn more about that and support so there's as much synergy there as possible.
Thanks, Joey. Helpful. Okay, so just as a form of summary, it sounds like what we're talking about here is when the subcommittees go forth over the coming weeks and have these conversations, it will be helpful to do a couple of things. One, bucket them up in those 2 or 3 buckets, depending how you want to do it. One is clearly around public engagement, another is clearly around technical analysis, and another one may be about general support for the work. And then 2, it would be helpful for subcommittees to do something that reflects some prioritization, right? In a world of which there's not infinite resources, it's great to put forward a lot of ideas. Let us know which of these ideas really you want to make sure are towards the top, right? Whatever prioritization works for you, but give some signal. That's what I'm hearing. Okay. I'll also say it's probably going to be pretty important to have these ready more than a day before the next meeting. So let's see if subcommittees can help get those ready with enough time for you all as a council to read them and think about it, enough time for us as support to prepare a conversation that feels meaningful. All right, that's my plea to subcommittees. All right, let's pause for some public comments. So if you've been listening to our conversations today and you'd like to make a comment, this is a good time to do it. And like Annette, just go ahead and put your hand up in the Zoom and we'll get you. If you'd like to drop something in the chat now, that's fine too. Annette, go right ahead, please.
Thank you. I wonder if I'm the only public present today. I have a few comments or questions. I noted that there were some additional public comment periods added to the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting the other day on the agenda, but they were just skipped over. So while I appreciate the effort to do more interactive public comment, it didn't work the other day. I have a question about the House appointees, because I understand they were for 2 years, and we know that Chris Campany is leaving, and I have seen some public outreach to fill his seat, but I gather there may be other people leaving. And if that's the case, are these just seats for life unless someone leaves, or what is the process going on for the House to review who is on them, and are other people leaving? And if they are, what's being done to fill them? Along those same lines, while I understand there are changes taking place in the sort of governance and oversight of the council, and that Jane's role will no longer exist, what will be Jane's role, if any? And then my final comment is on the Just Transitions budget, which I will note that I received some negative feedback on the people who were hired to do the public outreach before. And so I wonder if there has been any evaluation about the who was hired, and any sort of, hard look at whether this is the right approach. I deal a lot with the public. And so after all of those public meetings that were held, I heard back from people, and a lot of it wasn't positive. And for a $1.2 million budget to do public outreach, I would hope that there's been some vetting, maybe some looking in the mirror, maybe some evaluation of how to do it better. So thank you. Those are my comments.
Sorry, I'm on mute myself. Thanks, Annette. That's helpful. And after the break, there's an opportunity for folks to discuss these. And if there's any immediate answers and things, let's do that after the break. And then obviously be committed to getting back some answers to those questions. Okay, anybody else who is observing our meeting today that would like to comment? Okay, I'm not seeing additionals, folks in the chat or raising hands. So why don't we do this? Let's take a break. Let's come back. Let's come back at, and the schedule says 12:45, but I just think that's an unrealistic break. Let's come back at 12:50 and hit the ground running. So if you can sign on a little bit before 12:50, that'd be great. And we'll see you back here And we'll have a quick reflection on Annette's comments, and then let's get into the transportation recommendations. All right, thanks everyone. Really appreciate the conversation. I'm going to turn my camera off and I'll see you back here at a little bit before 10 of. Just let everybody get going here. Okay, I think we've got enough, folks. So prior to going and talking about the transportation recommendations that are coming out of that task group, I want to do two quick things. I'd like to create a space to react to some of the public comment you just received. I also want to make sure we're walking out of this with a shared set of expectations on the previous conversation of budgeting and what we're asking the subcommittees to do and what you'll do on your next meeting, October 19th or whatever it is, 17th. I just want to make sure we're able to pull that together. And well, let me do that first, and then we'll do a quick any reactions folks have to the public comment. Great. So when we ended, I had suggested that each of the subcommittees use the three buckets that Rich and Joey had laid out as a way of bucketing up in similar ways the budget priorities. So that was one, and we can, I'll make sure those get distributed around. Remember, the three buckets are public engagement and outreach, technical analysis, other analysis on specific components of the CAP, and then any kind of general support that you might consider necessary. Okay, so those were the three buckets. I mentioned it's also important that the way you present that suggests some prioritization explicitly. And so however you choose to do that, putting the things on the top of the list that are your top of the list, or highlighting one per bucket, whatever you believe is the right way to do that, but you need some explicit prioritization. And then finally, a timeline. We need to post these. Let's give ourselves a week prior to the meeting. So if the meeting is on the, let me just pull up my calendar, give me 1 sec, 17th, they need to be posted by the 10th, which really means we need to have them on Friday the 7th of October. Okay, so, and that allows for some time, not only for all of us to read those, but for us to design a meeting that's going to work well. Okay, so before I go any further, does that sound okay? To use those three buckets, to do some prioritization, and to get something to us, I say us, to the facilitators by October 7th, Friday. Any concerns with those three pieces? Okay.
Hey, David, this is Billy. Sorry. Can you just clarify what is, like, I know our group is going to have interest in like one-time spending for standalone projects that aren't really any of those three things. Is there a third bucket for just, implementation?
There isn't. And so I have a question. That's why I'm asking, right? Is like, are we missing something big, like implementing a program? And I think I heard Catherine and Erica talk about that as well, right? Sort of, are there actual projects that can be, whether it's pilots or others, that's another kind of bucket, right?
Okay. If you all say no, that's fine. I can bring that back to my group. I just wanted to ask a question.
I heard it from Rural Resilience, so I'm not sure why. I think why you wouldn't. For me, there's a question mark about size and scale. Like, what are we talking about here, right? And making sure that what's coming out of the subcommittees is at least in the realm of reasonable size and scale of the kind of budget we're referring to.
Thanks.
Bram and then Michelle.
So I think, just conceptually speaking, the budget that council needs is not an implementation budget. I think the budget that we need is budget for creating the plan and updating the plan, and that implementation is mostly in A&R's budget. So I think the three buckets that you laid out, it's stuff that we need, right? It's administrative support, it's data and analysis, it's public outreach. And that makes perfect sense to me. I think for us to, even think about implementation budgets would be duplicative of effort that's going to go on in the administration.
Thanks, Bram. Michelle? Hold on one second, Michelle. You're still on mute.
Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to reiterate Secretary Clauser's comments related to, and I think also Deputy Secretary Gendron mentioned this, really identifying the things that are already underway. In the transportation sector, I would say that there are several postings on today's agenda articulating the many things that are underway in the transportation sector. And that's not to say that's exhaustive of all the things that need to be done, but thinking about the time horizon, which I understand clearly feels that we never are moving fast enough with things related to the investments we're making in climate and the changes that we are seeking to implement. But also sort of looking at this budgeting exercise in the framework of activities underway, the efforts it'll take to implement those activities. And I think this is outside of what Graham just mentioned in terms of maybe some of the programmatic things that are happening. So I just would ask that those be taken into consideration. And are there programmatic things that we haven't started that perhaps there are IIJA or other federal funding streams that could assist in implementing those activities that may be discretionary funds that need to be applied for. So I just offer that up.
Okay, so those are two different views on that. Chris?
Just a quick comment to Bram. Bram, I mean, being such a small state and all, really, there are a lot of folk who are on the council and then the subcommittees who are well positioned to kind of say, hey, these items are ripe for implementation, especially given the various funding pools and what's allowed to happen to that funding. I mean, and I would hate to create, I'm always hesitant to create yet another thing, but if it doesn't exist already, and somehow I turn 55 tomorrow, so I'm beginning to forget more stuff. But I don't know to what extent there is like some kind of small group, hopefully small, that's kind of looking at all these different places that intersect and all the different agencies, how they intersect, and like what's happening as far as implementation already around the plan and what things are going to look like, especially once the Inflation Reduction Act is going to ultimately be implemented. There's a lot of opportunity there, I would think, for the council to help advise the legislature on what programs are ripe. And some of us, and I'm just in RPC land, we tend to be at the intersection of all kinds of different state initiatives and federal initiatives, and kind of have that view. But of course, folk within the state government are too, and then there are all the NGOs. So anyway, so Bram, not to dispute your recommendation, but I do think the council has a really important role to play on implementation.
Okay, Catherine?
Chris basically said what I was going to say, that I think implementation remains in the purview of the Climate Council. We spent so much time putting a plan together, and while there are myriad state agency efforts that are actually making real progress, I don't think we can ignore, nor should we ignore, the implementation recommendations of our plan that haven't been picked up by state agencies or other groups. And I know there are several in the space that the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Committee works in. So I think it's an important discussion to have.
Great. Rich?
Well, it sounds like we're proceeding on maybe two tracks. One track, has to do with the points that Bram made, and I agree with his points, that we need to ask for the budget that is needed in order for the council to do its job, number one. And I think we should do that under its own heading. And then I agree with what the last two speakers have just said, that the council has a role in identifying major funding streams that are needed and perhaps available to implement major portions of the cap. And we should do that separately. We should not try to conflate the implementation money with the funds that are necessary for the council just to do its job, including, by the way, doing the job of assessing what resources are out there that we could urge to be directed towards the cap implementation. So I'm suggesting that we should do this in two different streams.
Okay. Okay. So this is what I've written down. I think what'll, barring last minute thoughts on it, what I'm hopeful folks take back to the subcommittees, in that the buckets, these three are the top stream that Rich just talked about, and this is the separate one. We could separate them out more visually if you want to. The question marks are just more like if you have something there, right? So here are some buckets to work with. Here's an expectation that there'll be some sort of explicit prioritization in there. And the timeline we're talking about is to provide by October 7th, so it can be posted and shared around with all of you by October 10th. All right. So that's what I'm writing down is a summary to head out. And then the real question is, what do we do all together on October 17th, right? Which is we're taking this stuff in, hopefully providing a little more analysis if we need to, and then providing it out to the administration and to the legislature as the council's best thinking. All right. I think we're there on that. Let me stop sharing. Before we jump to transportation, I want to open up an opportunity to reflect on anything you heard during that public comment period. I heard three questions or comments. One was about public comment, yes, going the right direction, but it didn't quite nail it the last time across sector. A question about how the process happens for the House appointed seats. And then a question about Jane's ongoing role and what will be her role. And then a piece around, has there been any reflection of the public engagement that happened last year and the use of those funds? TJ, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. TJ Poor, I'm one of the co-chairs of Cross Sector, and I want to appreciate the comment from Annette that, I actually think that, and I want to say this for other subcommittees to the extent you're not doing it, having public comment at each interval or each subject of the meeting as you go forward is really valuable. And for the Cross Sector Mitigation Committee, that is a change that's happened over the last several months, and I think in part due to the conversations both in the committee and outside that we've had with Annette. And so thank you for that. I do want to kind of, just for the record, note that we did ask for public comment at each interval in that. And one of the things that happened, I think, was that there was a pause for public comment, and then the committee started to talk on the budget item a little bit longer. And it kind of gave the opportunity for a second generation conversation. And so we moved forward. So that might have been the reason for that. But I do think, the way we set it up was to have public comment, and before any decision could be made, that we really had the opportunity to engage with comments from folks that weren't on the subcommittee. So I can throw in the times. I took the time and the break to kind of check to make sure my recollection was right, that we did ask for public comment. We're really trying to be intentional about that for every topic as we go. And I can throw the times in the chat on when we did that, but keep holding us accountable there, because it's one of the most critical things we can do is to make sure that we're engaging kind of outside the Climate Council box and the box that we're in. So appreciate the comment and the process, and more comments where we can continue going forward. Thanks.
Thanks, TJ. Great. Okay. Kashka, you got your hand up. You're a member of the Just Transitions Subcommittee. Welcome. A quick reflection from you as we're reflecting on public comment.
Yes, thanks, David. And I appreciate you taking the time. Just to Annette's point regarding public engagement, I just wanted to make sure that it's out there, that, you know, I think public engagement, Just Transitions members would echo Annette's frustration. And that is why, you know, we're constantly striving to do things better. This was basically, we're coming in green, not knowing how or what to do. And, you know, part of it is putting together this robust budget that is needed to do real public engagement that's ongoing and substantial, just for the future, for right now. So to Annette's point, we didn't do a great job, but we're going to continue trying to do a better job. So if she has any ideas, just please let us know. You know, continue coming to the meetings and let us know how we can improve, because we welcome any ideas to help us do that. Thank you, Annette.
Thanks, Kashka. Okay. Anything else before we jump into transportation? I know that you all as a council don't have responsibility for what the House does on the appointment. So that's an interesting thing for the House to maybe provide a little bit more clarity on what their process is going to be on the appointments. All right, folks. Thanks. Let's dive into the transportation piece. And here I am not sure who is presenting, maybe Joey.
I can start.
Okay.
Well, let me just frame it up, and then I can lean into Jane and or Andrea, but Andrea from the agent VTrans is going to do a presentation, just sort of grounding us in as we set the table for this conversation and consideration. But just as a reminder, you know, when we adopted the climate action plan, I think we are all well aware of this. Our primary policy recommendation that would have delivered certain pollution reduction progress was the Transportation Climate Initiative, a regional cap and invest program that would have also generated sustained revenue to invest in, you know, a diverse transportation system and a more equitable network over time. We charged ourselves with coming back with a recommendation that would, you know, by June of 2022, we pushed that to fall of 2022, to quote unquote, pursue a comparable cap and invest program for transportation fuels, both in Vermont and regionally, or other policies and programs that reduce emissions and drive similar outcomes as anticipated in participation in the TCIP program. So that's the work that we've been doing. I can speak a little bit to more of that process. Ideally, after Andrea provides sort of a grounding in what VTrans is already doing, to the important point that Michelle raised, there is a lot of work underway. Vermont, think we are in a good position because we have a lot of programs that we have invested in, and we've expanded that investment with these new federal funds. So we have a really strong foundation upon which to build. And the goal of the recommendations that we want to talk about after Andrea's presentation is to figure out how do we, what do we identify and what do we need to do to ensure that we make certain pollution reduction progress in a cost-effective and equitable way. So that's the conversation that we're going to have after Andrea sort of sets the table for us about the existing programs, and the sense that we have through the the work required by VTrans, the carbon reduction strategy, what they're doing and what that will fill in. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Andrea, and then ideally we can talk about the memo and the work we need to do as a climate council.
Great. Thanks, Joey, and thanks everyone. A lot of content today, so definitely appreciate your stamina as we get through this. Let me see if I can get the technical side of this going.
Looks good.
Okay, just going to move you all up here. Okay. So good afternoon. Thanks for having me. My name's Andrea Wright, and I'm the Environmental Policy Manager with the Policy Planning and Intermodal Development Division at VTrans. And I want to thank you all for allowing the space in your agenda to hear from VTrans on the climate work that is underway, and to help provide some context for the transportation memo that was delivered to you late last week. I'm also joined today somewhere in this Zoom land by my colleague, Patrick Murphy. He's the Sustainability and Innovations Project Manager, and he is deep in the implementation of some of the programs that we'll be talking about today. And so wanted to have him here to help answer any questions that you all might have afterwards. So I guess I'll just ask that the questions be held to the end. And I guess I'll just say also that the presentation today is our climate actions in regards to greenhouse gas reductions, and won't go into resilience or hazard mitigation, that side of things. So as you all are very much aware, we have the greenhouse gas reduction requirements laid out in the GWSA. The CAP lays out recommendations to meet those requirements, and all that I will go through today relates very closely to the recommendations within the CAP. You've all seen presentations from ANR on this. States are amending and updating these regulations to require vehicle manufacturers to deliver even higher annual volumes of lower and no emitting vehicles. Last week and for the next 2 weeks, the Agency of Natural Resources, with support from several other state agencies, the utilities, Drive Electric Vermont, and Capstone Partners are all traveling the state and conducting a series of public engagement events. And while these rules will bring vehicles to Vermont, there are other programs that are needed to ensure that the vehicles are placed into service and that the infrastructure is in place to support the transition to electrification. So purchase incentives, why is it important? As you can see from this survey conducted by Efficiency Vermont, and really to no surprise, the #1 thing that would make those surveyed more likely to buy an EV was lower upfront cost. And then a lot of the other responses in the survey really related to the need for greater infrastructure to alleviate the anxiety about going to EVs. So to meet the GWSA requirements, we need the adoption of EVs to be successful. Our current incentive programs are shown here. Vermont is one of the only states that focuses incentive programs exclusively on income eligibility, and to date, nearly 40% of the EVs purchased or leased have been with the assistance of state incentives. The e-bike program was launched in July, and so far 132 incentives have been issued, with 69% of those funds benefiting Vermonters at the lowest income levels. We are slated to get the Replace Your Ride program launched this week. And one of the documents that we provided, and we could talk a lot about all of these different programs, but in the interest of time, we provided a document that goes into more detail about each of the various programs. And I believe that was posted online earlier today. Up until last year's T-bill, the state had invested just shy of about $10 million. And this year we're ramping up the new programs in our investments. We're also looking at optimizing incentives. Our consultant, who is overseeing the implementation of all the incentive programs other than Mileage Smart, will review program guidelines, income levels, vehicle caps, incentive amounts, and funding levels to estimate greenhouse gas reduction impacts and make adjustments where necessary to meet emission reduction and our equity objectives. And we expect that report to be done by the end of this year, and then annually for the term of the contract with the consultant, which is 3 years. So moving into the equipment to alleviate that anxiety. Since 2014, the state has invested approximately $6.5 million through a variety of funding sources, including the Volkswagen settlement funds, and that has resulted in approximately 262 chargers around the state. One of the most recent investments was $1 million to residential charging for multi-unit housing. And 23% of households do not live in single family homes. So there's the argument that charging is easy because it can be done at home, but that doesn't really hold true for these households. So these multi-unit funds are really important to reach varying populations. The FHWA announced in late 2022, as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. This is a formula program that provides $21 million to Vermont to deploy electric vehicle supply equipment. It requires the development of a plan that includes such elements as state agency coordination, public engagement, contracting, a vision and goals, implementation process, civil rights, equity, and labor and workforce considerations. And over the past 6 months, VTrans with Drive Electric Vermont has been working to develop that plan. We submitted the plan by the August 1st deadline, and we expect to have approval from Federal Highway by September 30th. We are now working on contracting methods so that our build out can begin in spring and summer of next year. And then when we are fully built out as certified by the Federal Highway, we will have more flexibility with the funding and can move into other locations. So on a parallel track to that interstate build out, we'll be moving into a public engagement process to understand the needs and to help determine where the investments can best serve the transition to electrification. So in the fiscal year 23 budget, we had $4.25 million from the NEVI, another $2 million for ARPA for the highway networks, and then $10 million to ACCD for level 1 and 2 charging for multifamily dwellings, workplaces, state parks, and community attractions. So really spreading out the infrastructure, and that will build upon the existing state and Volkswagen funds that have already been deployed. During the 2022 session, we also revised the state goal for EVSE deployment. They were updated to reflect a more aggressive build out with fast charging within 1 mile of every interstate exit and within 25 miles of the next fast charger on the interstate network. Previously, it had been to have fast charging within 30 miles of every Vermonter, and we were like 97% there. So had achieved that goal, time to move on to a more aggressive goal. So meeting the federal guidance of having 4 150 kilowatt ports within 1 mile of an exit and every 50 miles would require adding or upgrading about 15 fast charging locations throughout the state. Although we have infrastructure on the ground, none of our corridor segments right now are ready given the current guidance. So most, if not all, existing locations will be required to upgrade the number of ports and or the capacity of the chargers at the locations. And then looking at the needs beyond the highway build out, we can use this tool to estimate further needs. It gives us a sense of the scale that is needed, but not necessarily the funding needed. And we anticipate as the EV market supply increases, so will the demand for charging infrastructure. And so with that, the need for public funding should not be as great. We'll be looking more to private funding for that. And we'll also be working collaboratively with the EVSE work group to understand how best to use the available funds to drive towards the goals. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time here to talk about the fleet and other equipment electrification efforts. Vermont's transportation bills have set increasingly aggressive targets for electrifying the state government's passenger vehicle fleet. And so our fleet is transitioning. A little fun fact is that the Vermont Department of Motor Vehicles worked with Harley-Davidson motorcycles to design the Livewire. It's the company's first electric law enforcement vehicle. VTrans is responsible for its own medium and heavy duty truck fleet and is replacing combustion vehicles with electric vehicles as the funding and the technology allows. We're also in the process of electrifying previously gas-powered tools and equipment, from mowers and our chainsaws to even we're looking at purchasing a mini excavator, and that will only expand from there. And then to our facilities, VTrans owns or leases over 80 buildings across the state and has been installing EV charging infrastructure at these facilities. Currently, there are 13 locations with dual head level 2 chargers. And while most of the AOT facilities will be supported by those level 2 charging, some strategic locations will also host fast charging for longer trips and heavy duty equipment and a need for a quick turnaround. Our buildings are also looking at alternative energy sources. We have 18 garages using outdoor wood boilers. These boilers burn the cordwood that we cut from our rights of ways for safety reasons. We also recently converted the Tunbridge garage to heat pumps, and 6 of our garages have a 32 panel solar array. So to address the CAP pathway for vehicle miles traveled reductions, VTrans, in coordination with ACCD, has undertaken a study on smart growth. VTrans has contracted with Resource Systems Group to estimate the VMT and greenhouse gas reduction potential of smart growth strategies, as well as to quantify the potential health, safety, and economic co-benefits. And this study is slated to yield a report by the first quarter of 2023. The expectation in this space is that the short-term benefits of land use strategies in a state like Vermont with low population growth rates will be really quite modest, but that they will multiply over the long term. So as we approach those 2050 goals, having more success there. Land use decisions are made mainly at the local level, and VTrans can support and even reward the transportation efficient land use through project selection criteria and investment decisions. And to that end, VTrans is working more closely with the RPCs to understand those opportunities, and to reflect that has updated its transportation planning initiatives guidance to include smart growth and greater collaboration with the RPCs on that. We also have a number of programs aimed at reducing single occupancy vehicle trips. Early in 2022, VTrans released a public transit zero emission transition plan, which was required by the Vermont legislature and is an analysis of long-term fleet electrification costs, maintenance, infrastructure, and route viability. VTrans has received funding from 6 consecutive low and no emissions bus and bus facilities awards and 1 Volkswagen settlement award. And with that has supported the deployment of 16 battery electric buses and related charging infrastructure. And with the current funding, we project 25 battery electric buses on the road in the near future. We also have funds that we're using to create a transportation demand competitive grant program. That's the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grant Program. And it includes an annual application process, and the program allows for state funds to be used to match microtransit studies and pilots like fixed route versus on demand. Over 2020 and 2021, VTrans awarded 25 mobility and transportation innovation grants. So although a good portion of the greenhouse gas reductions will come from those technology related initiatives, we also need to be looking at all of our programs and at our policy options. The carbon reduction program was announced again in November under the IIJA, and implementation guidelines were issued in late May. The purpose of the program is to reduce transportation emissions through the development of state carbon reduction strategies and by funding projects designed to reduce transportation emissions. We have access to these funds right now, but we want to be sure that we're being thoughtful and intentional and inclusive in our decision makings. And so with the guidelines was a requirement to develop a carbon reduction strategy, and that will help us determine how we want to roll these funds out by looking really comprehensively at all of our programs. The carbon reduction strategy is due to Federal Highway for approval by November 2023. And I should also note that the 2022 T-bill directs VTrans to work directly with the Climate Council to ensure that the carbon reduction funds projected for the 2024 and 2026 align with recommendations of the CAB. So this is sort of our initial conversation, and we'll be having much more as our strategy continues forward. We are really excited to have Cambridge Systematics as our consultant conducting this work for us. They've done a lot of work in this space. They've done analyses for the TCI. They set up a similar program for Colorado DOT, and they literally wrote the book on how DOTs can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So they're a great asset to us. The objectives of the carbon reduction strategy are first to develop a methodology to estimate the effect on greenhouse gas emissions of the investments in the Agency of Transportation capital program, and that can be applied by VTrans staff each year to, in coordination with the Agency of Natural Resources Climate Action Office, track and report the progress towards achieving the state's greenhouse reduction requirements. And then considering existing programs, data and analyses, and the tools that exist now, assess potential future policy and programs and funding options to cost effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, and ultimately develop an investment strategy consistent with the federal carbon reduction program guidance and the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements. So this work will be completed in two phases. The first to develop and apply a methodology, and the second to develop a strategy that supports the reduction of transportation sector emissions in the state. We'll test the methodology with the 23 capital program to establish sort of a baseline, and then we'll apply it to the 24 program, and we'll be presenting that analysis to the legislature at the beginning of this session. The agency has established a technical committee with subject matter experts from the Agency of Transportation, Agency of Natural Resources, members of the Transportation Task Group from UVM, and then also the Chittenden County RPC and the Energy Action Network. So the technical committee will be most active during phase 1 to help guide the development of the methodology, and then a little less so during phase 2, but they will review and comment on the application of the methodology as it's used to evaluate the different strategies. We held our kickoff meeting with the technical committee this past Friday and had some great dialogue on the data needs and the project, and just to help inform that methodology. The agency will also establish an advisory committee with a broader group of stakeholders, and that will help guide the identification of the strategies that will be recommended in the plan. Most of the advisory committee's work will be during that phase 2. One of the things that really stuck out for us with Cambridge Systematics' proposal and was sort of a testament to their work in this space was the acknowledgement of strategies that are likely to get the greatest results, the recognition of the challenges to each of those strategies, and the role that the agency can play with each strategy. They laid that out very well to us. One of those recognitions was the technical challenge in evaluating a capital program. Their proposed solution to this in past projects with Colorado DOT specifically, I believe, has been to create a point system to provide greenhouse gas emission reduction estimates per unit of investment. So if you put in a mile of new bicycle or pedestrian facility, you would achieve X points, and a point would be equivalent to a metric ton of greenhouse gases. VTrans envisions during phase 2 an engagement process that we'll hear from the Vermont Climate Council, including the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee and the transportation work group, other partner agencies, regional planning commissions, and other stakeholder groups, as well as the public, to guide the development of the strategy. Based on the phase 1 work, we'll quantify the gap that needs to be closed in the greenhouse gas reduction accounting for current level of investments, and use a methodology to evaluate current programs implemented via the agency and also statewide. The consultant will then identify the strategies or combination of strategies necessary to help achieve the reduction requirements. And these, they might include typical transportation infrastructure and service investments, such as bike ped facilities, transit, rail, transportation demand management programs, but the evaluation will also consider overarching policy and regulatory approaches, such as direct carbon pollution pricing, cap and invest programs, performance standards. We've asked them to really look at the gamut. And in fact, the work calls for one scenario to evaluate specifically and exclusively typical transportation infrastructure and service investments, and then one that is specifically and exclusively for the policy and regulatory approaches. And I think that's important to understand given the transportation memo recommendations. The strategy will recommend a preferred alternative that may be one of the scenarios, or it might be incorporate elements of several different scenarios. And then in this last slide, I just wanted to show an example of what the analysis this work will lead to, and how it relates to co-benefits, including health and workforce and others. We expect this sort of evaluation matrix and analysis to happen. And really just to show that this work is really going to be a holistic look at all aspects of transportation and lead us to a really comprehensive strategy for the most cost-effective and beneficial solutions. And that is all I had. Happy to have Patrick join me if there are questions, or turn it back over to Joey if she wants to go into more detail about the memo.
Might I suggest that we talk about the memo for a little bit and how it relates to what you just presented, Andrea, and if we've got questions on that, we'll circle back. But I'd really like to hear about what the memo is putting out in terms of what the council should be recommending, given all this work that's happening. So
And I'm
Joey,
trying to figure out how to stop share. Okay, it's up there. Yeah.
So maybe I can take a stab at framing it out a little bit and then invite others who help craft the memo to contextualize this and have a conversation with everyone. So, I mean, clearly, as you can see from what Andrea just presented, there's a huge amount of really good work happening in VTrans and some really strong programs. And there's this significant, obviously, unprecedented infusion of federal dollars through infrastructure, ARPA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and trying to figure out what all that means and how we maximize that opportunity cost effectively and equitably. What the memo did is, again, deliver on what we said we were going to do when we adopted the initial plan. The plan at this moment still lacks one or more policy or regulatory tools that will achieve or, do our best to make certain that we achieve the legal obligations laid out in the Global Warming Solutions Act to, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And there's obviously an interim 2025 target as well. And yes, we have some significant endeavors underway. Advanced Clean Cars, Advanced Clean Trucks is one of those things. That will add up to, significant reductions. That is also obviously a vehicle-centered pathway. We know we need to build a more diverse, clean, equitable, and accessible transportation network. And we're likely going to need funds after we aim to maximize through this carbon reduction analysis and optimization study that VTrans is leading on with Cambridge Systematics, which I agree is really important and great that we have them as partners. So we're going to need to maximize the dollars that are coming in to do this work really cost effectively and equitably. But what the memo articulates and the work that we have been doing to date, back in January, we delivered a memo sort of painting the picture of where we're at. and what we thought we needed to do, which was a lot more public engagement and sort of work to analyze what a non-TCIP recommendation or recommendations might be. We began that work early on in that process. It became pretty clear that we were not going to have the dollars we needed to do in the time that we thought we needed to do it. Again, along the lines we set for ourselves as a climate council, to have the economic analysis and sufficient public engagement to really identify the core, policy recommendation in lieu of TCIP. So we have been meeting very regularly as a transportation task group for the last few months. We've had an annual publicly warned 3:30 Monday meeting. That fun is still happening because the work is not done. But what the memo lays out for you is our thoughts on, a good and thoughtful process based on everything that is underway, including this carbon reduction strategy, and our recommendations to make progress in service of our legal and moral obligation. And so what we identified in that memo has now become a consensus-based recommendation, I'd say, of cross-sector. We talked about it last week, that we believe that these recommendations will set us on a path to make some short-term, to do some more time-limited, sort of lifts that we will need to do no matter what policy or regulatory approach we choose to take. And that bigger question is, which is why the memo essentially just says fundamentally what we're doing now and the recommendations of the plan don't add up to the legal progress we need to make in the transportation sector, 40% of our emissions, and that we know we're going to need to identify a regulatory policy tool or tools to deliver on that obligation, and that we will need to do more public engagement and more work, and that some of that work is going to happen through the carbon reduction strategy, and probably can do some things or ask the legislature to do some things to make sure that we have the frameworks in place to ready us for when we do identify that strategy or strategies. I think I just dropped the memo in the chat. Ideally, if some folks had a chance to review it, it's pretty short. It's not radically different than what we had laid out before. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but would it be helpful if I just shared my screen for a second with the final bullet points of the memo? You could just do the, extra high level version of what this really means and what's being, it's really just the core of the proposal are these bullets, as I understand it. Yep. Right. If you want to just walk people, quickly through what these bullets are saying, because I loved your high level overview. And now if we could just do one more double click to say what it is you're recommending.
Yeah, I guess, yes, I can definitely do that. So again, our analysis is that we need a policy or regulatory tool or tools to make sure we are on track to deliver on our legal obligation. And in the meantime, what the bullets underscore is sort of like shorter term foundational strategies. We recognize the need to continue to advance cornerstone measures like Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks, which obviously the Agency of Natural Resources, as you heard from Andrea and you all know, and ideally you're participating in these public engagement forums that are designed to inform that rulemaking and the transportation conversation more broadly. That's a piece of it. And we are recognizing the need to continue to do outreach and public engagement and do that better and earlier in the conversations related to transportation and do that more closely with Just Transitions. We've started to do that through Advanced Clean Cars and Advanced Clean Trucks. There's more work to do and a need there. Recognize the need to, again, this is what VTrans is doing, like how to maximize and optimize existing incentive programs, including the EV incentive program, to deliver cost-effective greenhouse gas emissions. And one lens we wanted to put on that, or at least ask VTrans to analyze and consider in any potential changes to those programs, is how do we help folks who have to drive more, or who use more energy to, make that transition earlier. So looking at sort of strategic design of existing programs, another piece that we just want to underscore delivering on is if TCIP, this is the last sub bullet, is resurrected, because it is sort of a cap and invest program that is quote unquote sort of on the shelf that states could implement if other states like Vermont deem such a program to be necessary and to deliver on their carbon cost reduction and equity goals, that is something that we should explore and be ready to engage in if the opportunity arises. And then the last two bullets, just making sure that there is a framework for legal jurisdiction for, the ANR to implement any potential program. So ensuring that legal framework exists for them to have jurisdiction over this sector. And then fundamentally ensuring that we have the sort of timely, accurate, and more Vermont specific granular data to gird any potential program. So recommending the ANR establish a new greenhouse gas emissions reporting program, building on what we are already doing, but to use different data sets that give us a greater sense of what's actually happening and how do we set this program up for success. So I'm throwing a ton at you all, and I'm wondering if anyone else, Gina, unfortunately, my transportation task group co-lead, could not be with us today, but we've had some strong participation by several folks on this call, including from VTrans and DEC. So I don't know if anyone else wants to round out the context that I just lent before we have a bigger conversation.
Sure, thanks. So helpful. Thanks, Joey. Yeah, Jared, go ahead, and then let's dive into some questions that counselors have about this. Jared, go ahead.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Joey and Andrea. I just want to provide a little bit of additional context. And I think that it's helpful to just step back a second and reground ourselves in the Global Warming Solutions Act, because at the end of the day, what we're going to be measured by isn't how much activity we undertake, how much money we spend. It is whether we meet, in part, including but not limited to, the legal requirements for greenhouse gas reduction. I just want to, Section 3 of the law strikes the word goals from statute and establishes these as legally binding emissions reduction requirements. And I think the hard truth is that when we step back and look at what we can actually measure in terms of what is moving forward, the only recommendation from the Climate Action Plan that has moved forward that has the ability to make a significant impact in emissions reduction, as significant meaning a double-digit reduction in emissions, is Advanced Clean Cars 2. And the analysis that has been done by EAN and Supplement, and then ANR has done more recent analysis, shows that what we can expect to achieve through Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks is likely somewhere between getting a quarter to a third of the way towards the transportation sector reductions, which means in terms of our overall economy-wide required reductions, only about 10 to 14% of the way there. The other major policies that would have given us significant progress, double-digit progress, in addition to that, have not moved forward. So it's all on this one thing that gets us 10 to 14% of where we need to be towards 2030. And so in that context, this group looked at what are, in terms of other states, provinces, countries, what are the strategies that can deliver a degree of clarity, a degree of confidence, given that these are requirements and not goals? And what we found when we did that scan of other states, provinces, countries, is that there's really only two policies that we are aware of that can provide a degree of confidence in terms of meeting requirements. And it is either, and they are very broad categories. It does not lock us into one very specific thing. But unless we do at least one, perhaps both, of an emissions cap program, those can be cap and reduce programs, cap and invest programs. They come in all sorts of different variations. Many different states and countries are using them. or a performance standard program in terms of standards on and requirements on fossil fuel importers, then, you know, to paraphrase, we have little to no confidence that we can have an assurance that we will meet these requirements. And so I think that's really important context here. And, you know, at a certain point, it can't just be about the number of programs, the amount of money. It has to be, are we advancing the policies and regulations that can provide certainty and clarity in terms of what are legal requirements? So I'm just going to leave it there for now.
Thanks, Jared. Okay, great. All right, folks. So we've got a few minutes here to think about this. We're not actually going to make a decision on these recommendations today. We're going to do that next meeting or later on in the fall. This is an opportunity to wrap our heads around it, see if we're close to the mark, and give any feedback we need to give to this task group that's been working hard to figure out this puzzle. Bram?
Thanks. You know, I would just add, as a member of the task group and the subcommittee that worked on this, we spent a lot of time talking. The last two words we added were currently known. And, you know, I think we want to recognize that, as Jared said, a comprehensive review of all the tools out there suggests that currently there are one or both of two big areas, either cap, trade, reduce, invest, or performance standard. And it is also true that the technology and the policies that are being implemented around the world are both evolving rapidly. And I think it's our job as a council to stay current with new possibilities. And if we get some ways down the road in a year or two and something new appears that will do the job better, faster, more cost effectively, or more justly, we can absolutely change course. But you know, we can't sit around and hope that something new and better appears. We have two paths that will get us there now, and we have to take one or both of them.
Thanks, Bram. Yeah, helpful context. Chris?
Yeah, just to say the task group really has put many hours of deliberation into this, and you know, to my mind, the letter of recommendations really does state what Jared said, which is these are the choices we've got, and we're really are to the point where if people have other ideas, we really need specifics at this point, not just kind of because we're at the point where, you know, we really need to see, are we going to actually be able to achieve what the Global Warming Solutions Act says. And just one note for whoever else is listening out there, you know, the advanced clean cars rule, even if Vermont didn't participate, it's happening because enough other, you know, other states participating that I think it would represent a third of the vehicles sold in the United States in a year would be affected by that rule. And also the European Union is on a path to adopt a very similar rule about, you know, no more internal combustion engine cars by 2035. So just, I really do hope people will participate in the discussions and the meetings around the advanced clean car rule, because I think part of what we really need to talk about in Vermont is this is coming. It's not a debate. And so how do we make this work in all of our communities and for all of our residents? So we really are at the point with transportation where we're down to brass tacks, like actual actions. Just wanted to put that out there. And if other people want to join the task group and deliberate, that's awesome. But I don't think we've got a lot of options.
That's great. Okay. I just want to make a pause here for those who were not involved in these conversations in cross-sector or in this task group. If anybody has any questions who has not been involved in this and is looking at this and is wondering, you know, something's not entirely clear, let me just take a quick pause, because I know Rich, you and Jared have been involved through cross-sector in this. So I just want to pause for 1 second, see if others who have not been involved have any doubts or questions. Okay. Rich, go ahead. And then let's try to wrap this up in just a minute or two, all right?
So I am echoing comments that have been made by the previous speakers, as Chris just said. We are down to brass tacks in that in order to meet the requirements of the statute, and frankly, what I consider to be the moral requirements of an advanced economy to reduce emissions, we need to do more than promote voluntary policies. So we need something, a performance standard of some kind or a cap of some kind that will ensure that we stay on track. And at our meeting this past week, I mentioned an experience from the United Kingdom that I was familiar with, where this was in the building sector, but it illustrates the point. There was a carbon emission reduction requirement put on electric utilities to reduce emissions. And it was a requirement. And they implemented that requirement by fairly, creatively enrolling end-use customers in reducing emissions from the gas sector. And the UK had a change of government. The government decided that the market should take care of this. We should allow individual choice to reign, and we would provide incentives only. They came up with a really strong incentive program. They promoted the heck out of it. And they did away with the mandate and went to incentives only. And in the first 6 months of that new program, the rate of insulation jobs in the United Kingdom dropped by 90%. The home weatherization program in the country just collapsed. And it just serves as kind of a reminder that we frequently need more, end-use customers need more assistance than the opportunity to apply for a partial incentive in order to make significant changes. And that isn't directly applicable to the principle is directly applicable to transportation as well as housing. But the object lesson is that we need more than we're doing right now. And the committee, that's what the committee is calling for.
Right, Rich. Before I jump back to you, Jared, I want to do just something quick in the chat to really pull out all counselors for 1 second, which is you're just looking at this memo. Maybe you read it before the meeting. You've heard Joey explain it, really helpful. You heard everything that VTrans is doing. And I just want to do one of these temperature checks in the chat. And this is for counselors. And I'll just ask that is, on the sort of 1, 2, 3 scale, check out what I just put in the chat, right? Like overall, how are you as a counselor feeling about, like, how comfortable are you about these recommendations that are in the memo right now, right? You're comfortable, which you put a 1 in the chat if you're a counselor. Okay, but for some changes, put a 2 in the chat. And if you're feeling quite uncomfortable about how that memo came out and you're looking for some significant changes, drop a 3 in the chat. And I'd like for all the counselors, even if you're still digesting, like where do you think you are right now? So let's just pause for 1 second and see what happens in the chat. Counselors, drop a 1, 2, or 3 in the chat based on how you're reacting to this memo and what you understand of it now. Great. I'm just watching the chat. We can all sit here for 1 second and do that if you don't mind. And don't be shy, right? Because we're gonna actually more formally approve this at a subsequent meeting. Yeah, 4 still digesting. Thanks, Leslie. Fair answer. Okay. All right. Great. Thanks, everyone. And if you're thinking of some things that you'd like to see, prefer some changes, I would say please send a follow-up email to Joey and company and CC me and Jane and others and just say, yep, this is what I'm thinking, right? So when we come back the next time we talk about it, we already have the benefit of those ideas, okay? Jared, last word, and then I really want to make time for public comment before we finish up. All right.
Thanks, David. I'll work to make this quick. It's not something that was in the memo, but I think is really important context for us to consider as we look at the memo. And that is the timing component of this. And I know some folks in subcommittee have heard me say this, and I may sound like a broken record, but I think it is such an important point for us all to be aware of. And that is 2030 may seem like it is in the distant future. However, for a policy or a regulation to actually begin having an impact, there is a lot of inertia in the system. So if we put forward a recommendation as a council, which we don't have a specific recommendation right now, we're saying we have to do one of two things. Imagine that a cap or a performance standard policy passes the legislature, gets signed by the governor this year. That will likely require at least 2, maybe 3 years of implementation. And then it's not until 2026, 2027 that such a law actually then begins having an impact. So if we think about that process from passage to implementation to impact, because we have waited so long and do not yet have these key policy requirements, what we're likely limiting ourselves to is 3 or 4 years of them actively being in place to meet the 2030 requirements, let alone the 2025 requirements. So I just want to ensure that folks understand that 2030 may seem a while away, but there is an urgency, because if we do not act this year, I do not see how we can have any confidence that we'll have enough remaining time to allow that process to play out to actually be able to meet the requirements. And we'll be kind of baking the cake. And then when we know we've missed the requirements on the back end, won't be able to do anything about it. And the options will be very blunt and costly. So I want to make that warning as clear as I can, because it's very important.
Thanks, Jerry. Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay. So thanks everyone who's put all this effort into trying to tease out what's really going to work. It seems like based on the chat, there's interest in digesting more, and also a general sense of this is going in the right direction. If you are a 2 or a 3 or a 4, please do send some information into the task group. And as Chris Campany says in the chat, as specific as possible is greatly appreciated. And we will circle back at a subsequent meeting and formally say yes to this memo and approach. Okay. Let's take a pause. If folks who have been observing our meeting want to make a public comment now, let's open up one more space for public comment before we adjourn today. Would anybody who's listening in to our conversation today want to comment? Okay. I'm not seeing anybody. Feel free to use the chat too if you're here and you'd like to make a comment. Okay, great, excellent. Before we sign off, just a quick comment on next steps. Our next meeting as a council will be that meeting we've referenced already, October 17th, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Jane and others. And a primary focus of that will be to circle back on this budgeting conversation and figure out exactly what this council wants to say about that. And please, with your subcommittees, help get us that information to have that conversation by October 7th. Jane or others or Secretary Clauser, anything else on next steps that we should say? Good? Okay. Excellent, folks. Well, thanks. It was nice to see you all today. A good conversation on both fronts. We'll see you in a month. Let us know if there's helpful things we can do in your subcommittee conversations. We'll send out these notes so you have those buckets and you have what we agreed to today. And biomass, yes, biomass is a focus of October. Yes, absolutely. Okay, take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, great rest of your day. All the best.